Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed from the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet in Highland Park, New Jersey. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Shechter Day School, Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Anshe Chesed in New York City. It's great to see you. We are starting the summer and we have to have a few shout outs. First of all, we are saying Mazel Tov to Charlie and Barbara Mann. They are loyal listeners, loyal watchers of the Parsha Talk. This is their 50th anniversary,
52nd.
52nd. Mazel Tov. And Mazel Tov also to all the staff that are coming up to Ramah this week, Staff Week. I think we're going to be playing on the camp speakers on Kol Ramah this week. Not live, but we're going to be there. And a big shout out to our good friend, Tommy Shemesh. Shalom, Tommy.
Shalom, Tommy Shemesh.
Shemesh Sorachat.
On behalf of the three of us, Mitch Mernick, what a great job you've been doing, getting our podcast, getting our show to all of our listeners. We have, I think, over 2 listeners, 200. Between the three of us and Ramah, we have quite a loyal following. I keep promising T-shirts and the like. And we love getting your responses. We had a very interesting response this week from one listener who took us to task on how critical we were of Moshe. It requires, I think, a really thorough response. We're not going to go into it now, but just to say that yeah, Moshe deserves a little bit of criticism. All of our leaders deserve criticism. He, of course, had a difficult task. We all acknowledge that, but you know, we hold him to a higher standard. At any rate, Balak this week, Parshat Balak. Wow, what an amazing parsha we have. This is. It represents a change of tactics. Balak, Melech Moab, is the king of Moab. Just to orient ourselves in the story, Israel is now coming through the desert and making its way into the land of Israel, had to circumnavigate around Edom because Edom did not let them through. And now they had a skirmish with Sichon, the Amorite king, and Og, the Bashan, Og Melech HaBashan. And they are encountering Moab, Balak Melech Moab, the king of Moab. Balak sees that Israel has been victorious in these wars and really wants to change tactics. So he decides, he gets the idea, the strategy that he's going to engage this prophet, Balaam. And Balaam he's going to ask Balaam to curse Israel. This is where we are in the story. Let's start off with just talking about Balaam a little bit. Give us a little bit of detail, if it's possible, and maybe your own characterization of him, maybe what you think of him. Jeremy, you want to give it a shot? This is your bar mitzvah parsha too, so.
So it is. How many years ago? I'm 55. So how many years ago was that?
42.
42 years ago.
The number of stations in Massey for next week.
All right, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So Balaam. Balaam is actually the only, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, there's Ramses to the Pharaoh of Egypt, but I think maybe the only character in the biblical narrative whose existence is testified to by non-Israelite sources. There were inscriptions mentioning Balaam from other people in the ancient Near East. So he's some sort of figure, to whatever extent it's a real person or a kind of a
mythic.
Balaam is a well-known seer and a spirit medium and a prophet. The rabbis say, there ends, there's never arose a prophet in Israel like Moses. The rabbis say about it, among Israel, there never arose another prophet like Moses. But among the nations, there was somebody who was his equal, and that was Balaam, who was Yodea Dat Elyon. He knows the divine mind, and he is portrayed as a kind of person who has this special and unique relationship with God. But he is, as this whole story is, this is the only passage, really in the in the Torah that is about how others see us. There's a big shift in perspective about how other people, not the Israelites, are looking at the Israelites. And so Balak, in his nervousness, sends for this, hired prophetic gun, and he sends to him. He's on the Euphrates River. That's where he lives. He's not part of this, immediate conflict or this immediate era. Unlike, Moab, who was a descendant of Lot, and Edom, who was a descendant of Esau. This is not Balaam's fight, right? He's somewhere else. He's a somewhat isolated or peripheral figure to all the things going on here, and he hires him. And we get a story of Balaam, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, that is very ambivalent, because on the one hand, there's some very negative features of Balaam's behavior. But one thing that he always says is, I'm just a vessel for God on high. I just say what God says. This is not about me. And so there's one way to read this fellow that he is very loyal to the divine.
So I would take that with a lot of criticism and say, it's a boast of piety to say, I'm just the Lord's vessel. I'm just the Lord's vessel, because, when Balak asks him and says, we're going to pay for you, he says, you couldn't pay me all the gold in the world, right? And because I only speak what God tells me. And, when I read that pasuk, I think you could have just said no and walked away. But I get the sense that he loves being flattered. He's a prophet. He's a guy who has a big reputation. He probably knows how to, we can see later on in the Parsha, he knows how to write a sentence. He knows how to give a word, right? He loves the audience. He loves the theater of prophecy, and he can be bought.
Well, I think that might be a little bit unfair to him to say that he could be bought. He could only be bought if he said something that he shouldn't have said. And where is the evidence of that? But when you were talking, what struck me is that the way Jeremy described him, he's sort of an aloof figure. He's not part of the location where he's going to prophesy. And I think that's an important point, because where Balaam comes in for biblical criticism, as criticism by the Bible, not the documentary hypothesis, is when he gets involved with the natives in Baal Peor, and he's going to be killed in another week or two. And then he's on the scene. Right here, I think we could see him as an instrument. And, I guess it depends in part on how he parsed the wonderful comedy of the talking donkey. But he does speak for God, and he seems to be faithful to that. It's not like he takes the money and then he could have just as easily taken the money and said what Balak wanted to hear. What difference would it have made to him?
So what I see in Balaam is that he's a remarkably talented person, a man with great prophetic gifts and great linguistic gifts, but lacking the moral fortitude of an Abraham or a Moshe. And that tells us that a prophet is, the Hebrew prophet is someone who is kicking and screaming the whole way. The Gentile prophet is someone who says, yeah, I'm not going to go, but maybe, if you pay me a little bit. And obviously the Torah is engaged in a kind of polemic against him, okay? And makes him out to be a fool. How does he make him out to be a fool? Because in the scene, so, after God then says to him, no, you can't go, no, you can't go. Okay, you can go. And so he goes on his donkey, and the donkey, sees the angel im charbo shlufa with the sword extended, and the donkey, pushes Balaam against a wall, and Balaam in his, extreme, gentle, compassionate, moral sense, beats the hell out of the donkey, and the donkey then says, hey, what are you beating me up for? Okay.
So I think what we sometimes miss here is that the theological backdrop of the story in some ways is, how does God communicate, and how people that God communicates with hear or understand God. One of the things that I continue to think about a great deal is when we read a book, making allowances for the computer age, everything is black and white. There's no gray in the book, right? The print is black, the page is white. And so we don't always investigate how things appear. So the question, of course, is how does Balaam know it's God who's talking? And he doesn't know what's going on with the donkey until he becomes aware of it. And that's how it is with God. You don't always know. When we read the story, everything is certain. We know the end already. For most of us, we're reading the story over and over again. The surprise isn't in the unfolding of the story so much as the new details that we become aware of through constant reading and rereading.
All right. So here's a detail that, when it says, Vayigal Adonai et enei Balaam, which means that God, Vayigal is to kind of open his eyes or lift up the curtain or whatever. I read this and I'm going like, there may be an echo of a word here, which is Vayagel, which is, you remember when Jacob has to take the stone off the well, that it says Vayagel, he rolls the stone. He is covered with thickness. There is something that's thick that's covering his eyesight. Balaam.
Right, but let's look at it for a moment from Balaam's point of view, right? Okay. So God opens his eyes, as it were, but how does Balaam understand what's going on? Yeah. Does he have a burst of inspiration? And, again, I think that it's sometimes difficult for the person on the ground, as it were, to figure out God's message. I think a lot about the prophets. God communicates with them in symbols, and he's always asking them if they understood the symbol that they then have to interpret, right? Because it's not clear what God's message is. I want to add just one more point here. This passage about Balaam is often linked with the beginning of Vayikra, and the rabbis make a big point that Vayikra, God called, that's the prophetic address. It's with intention and it's with direct communication. The word that's used with Balaam is Vayikar, that God sort of happens. God is not in a constant communication with Balaam. And that also is an important distinction, the way our ancestors saw non-Israelites relative to themselves as media of God.
Jeremy, how do you weigh on this in this scene, in terms of what Balaam sees, how he responds, or just in general to his character and
well, it's when you read the whole passage knit together, as one. Of course, it is a satire of a man who is an ass, whose ass is smarter than him, and he's supposed to be. It does make a mockery of the prophet that even the mute
animal,
donkey animal can perceive what he cannot perceive. But I keep coming back, first of all, going to the other biblical criticism of the documentary hypothesis. It's often said that the donkey episode is a cut and paste job, and the otherwise sweep is no question that the guy can be bought. I totally agree with you, Elliot, that comment, if Balak would give me his whole house of gold and silver, has a negotiating tactic quality to it. But I am also drawn to a story that says, and we were talking about this before the recording began, about the sort of hostile designs that neighboring nations have upon Am Yisrael. This is a story about God being a force for blessing. Okay, and Balaam thinks that, certainly Balak thinks, and maybe Balaam is himself a little bit more subtle about it, that there can be words that can be said that can damage this people, but in the end, he is seized by and surrenders to blessing and becomes a vessel for praise, and I find that kind of awesome, that the story, it's true what you guys said about, the Hebrew prophets are ambivalent figures. They argue, they add their own voice. Balaam is a mouthpiece, right? He is like the talking donkey in a certain sense. He doesn't, we're not seeing a relationship with God. We're seeing something more like a spirit possession. But the spirit possession is a source of bracha. And it's kind of amazing that we, as Jews, have turned one of these words of the Gentile prophet into a major part of our synagogue life. Matovu ohalecha Yaakov.
So let's hold that for a second. I want to, I know some of the people that watch this, our colleagues, they get a lot of good ideas for their own divertory here. It's a big secret, right? Okay. So I want to put this one out here for you, which is along the lines that he is a prophet, but unlike the Hebrew prophets. Look, in this scene, Balaam encounters Malach Adonai Nitzav B'der, an angel, okay? We have Hebrew figures, biblical figures who encounter angels. Abraham, Jacob, and Moses.
And Joshua.
Abraham encounters angels. What does he do? He invites them in. Jacob encounters an angel. What does he do? He fights with them. Moshe sees an angel in the burning bush. What does he do? He goes closer. He comes. He says, hey, check this out. Bayar et malach, the charbosh lufa biyado. He sees the exhibition of power. And he all of a sudden he gets weak-kneed. Too critical here. And he's reverent to power. And this is what I see the problem here. This is not a guy who's going to say, hey, what are you doing here? Get out of my way. He likes and he respects power. He likes wealth, and he likes the theater. He likes the staging because, and now we'll shift over so Balak gets him, to agree, and finally goes up. And what does Balaam say? He says, make 7 altars, take 7 cows, take 7. What is that all about? That suggests I like the extravagant. I want to. If I were staging this, I'd have him in, real big regal clothing. He'd be, he'd be a total charlatan on the mountain with the 7 altars lighting up all the different sacrifices. And he's trying to get a response. And now his response is nothing what Balak wanted. It's blessings instead of curses, or favorable descriptions of Israel, as opposed to the horrible curses. The first one includes the phrase "Hen am levadad yishkon uvagoyim lo yitchashav," which means this people who dwells apart, uvagoyim lo yitchashav, and not considered among the nations.
So imagine that sentence being said. What is Balak in the make of a sentence like that? That could be a source of reassurance for him, because the people just need to pass by, right? Balak does not live in Canaan in Eretz Israel. He lives outside of it. So he's in the way of the Israelite journey. So this could reassure him. The question, of course, we're reading it in the Torah. What does it mean to us, the Israelites, or us, their descendants? How do we understand that we live apart like this? Are we going to treat our neighbors with disdain because we're better than they are? Are we going to recognize that there are boundaries for everything and we have a place and they have a place? It raises a lot of provocative questions, I think.
I think this is the central question to the eternal Jewish conversation. Jeremy, you want to weigh in?
I do want to. So let's pivot to that conversation. I just want to resist saying that he is a charlatan, because in fact, he does have a prophetic experience. God doesn't talk to people all that often. It's like there was a great a few weeks ago. I found a lovely Hasidic drash about Korach. It was sort of in praise of Korach to a certain extent. So listen, Korach. The Torah wrote down Korach's words in his names when he says Ki kol kidoshim uvetocham Adonai. The Ishbitzer Rebbe said the Torah wrote that down for all eternity in Korach's name. That's got to make him pretty special. And Jews have said Matovu alecha Balaam. These words are written down in his name. That's got to make him pretty special, and this experience pretty special. And he's blowing Balak's circuits when he says, essentially, Tamot nafshi mot yesharim v'tihi achariti kamohu. I want to be with these guys. I love these guys. I think that we shouldn't think of him as a total fake. We should think of him as somebody who's been deceived.
Okay, but I think that, Jeremy, you raise a fascinating point. So we're familiar with the rabbinic expression that if you quote something in someone's name, it brings redemption, or at least it causes their lips to move in the grave. But we all say matovu, and I've never seen a sitter where they attributed it actually to Balaam. So we take the words and we write him out. And that seems to be the ultimate rabbinic comment, that he is not worthy of redemption because we don't quote him.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but
okay,
I still want to say not a charlatan. Okay, but speaking about the other point, I think that this is really fascinating in this one section of the Torah, where again, as I noted before, it's the story that is told not from our perspective. Yeah. Right? It's the story that is told from those who look at us. And I think that the before Am Yisrael throughout history, and certainly today, the questions of whether you really are, could ever be, would even want to be, Am levadad yishkon v'goyim lo yitchashav, to be not counted as one of the nations. We see that going on in conversations, for example, throughout the 20th century about Zionism. What is it? Is it to be a nation like all the other nations? Is it to be La'or Goyim, the model nation? Do we, in fact, wish to, live in fortress Israel? Do we want to join the community of nations? What in the United States, where assimilation means something quite different? Do we want to have strong ethnic boundaries? Are we suspicious of those strong ethnic boundaries? That's what makes this story, I think, really, compelling as a discussion point for contemporary Jews.
So I want to just elaborate on that. I think it's really crucial. Look, we are at the cusp in the United States of re-entering the Iran deal, and Israel has said we will do everything possible to prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb, which will include maybe, acting alone. Up until now, Israel has acted alone and it acted in concert. If Israel uses the policy of Am levadad yishkon, right, you dwell among, means our interests can only be handled by ourselves. And we cannot rely on the superpower of the world to defend our interests, because the superpower has its own interests. And this is the, this is keeping many of us up at night, because we want the United States to be on the same page with Israel, especially when it comes to this issue, and we see that it's not. And we know that it's disastrous either way, that for Israel to act alone in this instance would probably result in disaster, and for Israel not to act alone was also, it's.
Well, listen, I think that the first of all, there's obviously all kinds of, I read anything I can about this topic, and presumably the people involved know a lot more than I do about it.
You can only hope.
One can only hope. But what was I going to say is that, Balak, and we talked about this a little bit before the recording began, Balak sees that Israel has successfully had wars against some of his neighboring people, and does not consider whether there is possibility for allyship. And it's like a barking dog, sort of. And I'm wondering, like, certainly about contemporary Medinat Yisrael, that sense coming out of the Shoah, of course, and coming out of some other early Israeli experiences that we have only ourselves to rely upon, is like kind of on steroids overmuch. And when there are friends, you can't say, listen, I'm on my own here, I don't trust you. Why would you say that to your friends? As much as possible, you want to say, I want to be with my friends. There may come times when you say, I can't rely on you, and I have to cut myself off for you. But I think that's long run, that doesn't look very encouraging.
Yeah, but it's about survival, and when it's about survival, you have to act alone. I think obviously I agree with you. We don't would that we know as much, but as policy, I think this is it may not be good policy or bad policy. It's a way of understanding ourselves in the world, and I think that Jews today have this great problem, especially Jews in America also, to understand themselves as separate and other, or to understand themselves as linked universally. And this is the precise line that divides, progressives from others, and divides, universalists from particularists, and really is one of the fault lines in Jewish people of today. Do we belong to the world, or are we our own separate people?
The answer simply must be a productive dialectic of both, right? If we are an isolated people, then like a cell membrane, okay, it has to keep some things in and some things out. If there's no membrane, there's no cell. If there's not a sense of Jewish uniqueness and particularism, Jewish community is meaningless. And if it's a kind of a rigid, keep the world out, I can't see that winning. I mean, obviously, I'm in favor of Jewish particularism. I like endogamy norms. I like senses that people are in, that their lives are, because they belong, the meaning of their lives is that they belong to Am Yisrael. That's my life. And that's the communities that I have been a member of and tried to work to build. But I also think that when on steroids, it becomes a little neurotic.
Okay. So just one more point on this, which is, I think Balaam is the archetype of the Universalist. He doesn't belong to any group. he is the universal man, and he doesn't speak from a particular experience, an ethnic experience, or an experience of people. All the great writers in the world, people who they are speaking from deep particular experiences and giving universal messages. He speaks from a universal perspective and only gives a particular message to the Jewish people.
So it's interesting the way that you put that, Elliot, because Balaam is speaking for God, I think. And what you're suggesting is that religion has to be specific, that there is no universal religion. And that's a defect in Balaam, is that he can't locate himself anywhere. And therefore, what seems to be good for everyone actually ends up being good for no one, except that his words are so beautiful.
His words are beautiful. They get enshrined in our sanctuaries, and Matovu Alecha Yaakov, and we sing them, and etc.
And just to add something about Matovu, why do we say Matovu at all? This quotation from the non-Jewish prophet, I think because when we enter into a holy space and we're attempting to communicate with the divine, we have to enlarge ourselves, that we're not supposed to withdraw into ourselves. We're supposed to expand out of ourselves, as it were. So here, I think our use of the words of Balaam in the liturgy is a kind of universalizing experience.
I totally disagree with you.
Well, you feel free.
I totally disagree. I think reciting these words does two things. One, it re-identifies ourselves with the experience of biblical Israel in the desert, and puts us and makes us understand ourselves as a nation in the process of becoming. Two, it's a coded message. It's a coded message to Jews who are reading the first line of this and not reading the last line of it. And the last line of that passage says, Yochal goyim tzarav v'atzmoteim yigarem v'chitzav imchas, which I don't have the English translation here, but let me just say it in general, which means you will eat your enemies and you will crush their bones, okay?
So it's like shfochamatcha.
Exactly. A Jew walks into shul in a diaspora where people are not so favorably inclined to Jews, anti-Semites, and people who want to destroy them. Walk in the Roman ghetto and see what's on the church outside the synagogue in Rome, and have the Hebrew scripture, announcing to you that you are sinners, all right? And have that experience as a pre-modern Jew, and understand that when you come into synagogue, the editors of the Siddur were saying, you're coming for fortification. You're coming not only to remind yourself that a Gentile saw goodness in you, but you're reminded that God said through this Gentile prophet that when you are faced with your enemies, you will make victorious.
So I think, though, for most people, they don't think of the last line. When we have what we have in the Siddur, which is a pastiche of biblical passages in many places, we're not always thinking about the context. Sometimes we're thinking about how the words relate with the other verses that they're put with. Absolutely. And I don't think that that negative message is frankly appropriate for coming into the synagogue. That prayer is an attempt to get past the negative message, I would think.
Yes. So my late teacher, Israel Silver, Rabbi Ezra Solomon, said this is the tension of the public and private. You know, that whole passage, Matova, the whole prayer is all about, you know, the stepping into prayer is, I want the most intimate feelings, you know, being expressed, and yet I'm doing it in a community. And so I'm at the junction point of my public and private emotions. Okay.
I think that the drash that you expounded about, you know, locating the Matova in the course of Balaam's larger oracle, you know, it's obviously not wrong. It refers somewhat surprisingly in that passage to Agag, like yes. The Amalekites. Like, how do the Amalekites get in here? But I also think that I'm going to go with Barry on this one. That it is a drash that can be made, and to certain people who can you know, and as we travel through the pardes of the multiple levels of reading it, it's a perfectly wonderful drash. But I think that the experience of worship that little pastiche paragraph creates is exactly otherwise. This is a blessed and beloved and wonderful place that you are entering, in which you are going to, you know, lihishtachavot b'yirah. You're going to worship and reverence, and I think it's a positive and not necessarily an adversarial moment. Of course, there's been adversarial moments throughout Jewish history. But I think that in macro, I think what's going on here is you're entering the sacred Jewish space. Isn't it wonderful?
Okay, fine. So I yes, liturgically it works that way. But let's not forget that this is exactly what you said earlier, Jeremy, about this is the way that others see us, and that running through this, and this is why I guess I'm a little charged about this, because we're living in a kind of spasm of anti-Semitism now, which has thrown the Jewish people on its ear. We really don't know how to deal with this, because we don't deal with this. You know, we want to be loved. You know, we can't understand why people hate us. But I would say this whole story is a prototype of anti-Semitism. In fact, the punchline, Nevarechecha varuch ve'orarechecha arur, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. You know, I've used that over the last little while as saying, you know, that's what anti-Semitism really is. Those who curse you will be cursed. Those who bless you will be. If only people understood that when you bless the Jewish people, you are blessing the principles, you are acknowledging the central principles which lead to a full and meaningful and fulfilled life. When you curse the Jewish people, you yourself will be cursed. You will deserve to be cursed. And that this is running through the story based on the fact that you have, you know, I've called him a charlatan and a canard. You know, he's obviously a sophisticated figure, Balaam. But even sophisticated figures can be duped in good ways and bad ways. And this is a whole comic story that plays up this big question: how do we function in the world? What's our place in the world? You know, and we're getting that experience in the desert already, and we're going to move through it. And you know, as the parsha ends, it's also moving through this experience. I mean, take us to the end of the parsha, maybe. You know, you had something interesting to say about how the parsha ends. And
well, shortly after the episode of the oracles, there's a kind of an orgiastic scene in which the Moabite women, the Israelite men sleep with the Moabite women in what seems like a sort of an orgiastic worship of their god Baal Peor. Baal Peor is like this, the grungiest, most, like, this is idol worship at its worst, right? In the crudest, or its best, the crudest and if there's refinement to spirituality to religion, Baal Peor is the exact opposite. And the rabbis understand that part of the worship of Baal Peor, because of a wordplay that goes on, is defecating on the idol. I mean, this is just the bottom of the pit. And so an Israelite man and a Midianite woman are engaged in such process, and Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron Kohen, as we say at a Brit Milah, we had a Brit Milah on the show yesterday. It was wonderful to welcome Judah Ezra Siegel, another member of Am Yisrael. Pinchas is enraged, and he's the ultimate fanatic. He takes a spear, and because Zimri ben Salu and Kozbi Batsur are physically arrayed in such a way that one spear blow can get them both, he gets them, and the way the story is portrayed is, from the curse, that didn't work. The Moabites were in trouble. They tried to curse, that didn't work. So they try something else, which is to seduce the people. And of course, people often don't resist sexual seductions. They fall into it. And so we couldn't get you with words, we're going to get you with bodies. And the Israelites very regrettably participate. And Pinchas is seen in his fanaticism in the Torah. The rabbis have a much less positive view of him. In the Torah, it's seen as his fanaticism staves off the plague. So in the way that we're talking about now, about how separate must we be?
Yes, exactly.
This story comes along and says, you guys got way too intermingled over there.
Exactly. And so I mean, we could use that as the overarching theme here. It's how do we mingle, get along mix with the nations, the other nations? We have had experience here. This parsha really gives us a kind of a different look at it. Sometimes comical, sometimes very serious, sometimes satirical. I mean, it's just, in a way, it takes us out of the other stories of rebellion and complaining, gives us a little bit of lightheartedness, a little bit of humor, a little bit of irony.
The end story is a dirty joke, but is serious, right? Like there's a kind of crude, dirty joke quality to it, but it raises these serious issues. I just want to say one other thing, by the way, about the universal and the particular, because this is my bar mitzvah from 1979. I have to say two things about this. First of all, I had a wonderful bar mitzvah experience thanks to the wonderful chazan of my synagogue as a child, Meir Elias, Meir ben Simcha. He was a wonderful guy. He was from Vilna. He was in the camps. I thought of him back in the day as ancient, but in reality, he probably wasn't 70 years old or maybe in his early 70s. He died shortly after my bar mitzvah. I loved everything about him. I loved studying with him, but I have to say, from my perspective now, I learned to recite a haftarah that I didn't even know what the words meant. Nothing. I was just a trained monkey for that day. And I feel very bad about it because the haftarah concludes with some of the most important words of the Bible, which we've seen in lots of places from Micha. Higid lecha adam ma tov u'ma Adonai doresh mimcha. It has been told to you, human being, Adam, what is good and what does God demand from you? Not Higid lecha Yisrael, Higid lecha, something particular. Adam, Micha, the prophet, is speaking to Adam, human being. He had been told what is good and what God demands of you. Ki im asot mishpat, do justice, ahavat chesed, love kindness, v'hatznei aleched, walk humbly with your God. And that's a kind of a human religion. Higid lecha Yisrael, ma tov, ma doresh mimcha. Keep Shabbos and don't eat meat and milk and give interest-free loans and all the things that are the constitutive of Jewish experience. That's not what Micha is talking about right here. He's talking about human religion. And so that to me is just an important nuance on the particularism and universalism dialectic that's going on here.
So what we might say is that the parsha with the haftarah preserve a tension that accompanies us throughout our lives, that our danger is that we think that this is a problem like the Gordian knot, that we're simply going to slice it and be done with it. But we can't. The Gordian knot image, if we're going to use that for a moment, is with us all the time. And we might entangle different threads at different times and do different things with it, but the knot itself is not going to go away. So the issues that we've raised, sometimes we'll answer them one way, sometimes we'll answer them another way, but our task is to remind ourselves that these are issues that don't go away, that we have to address and readdress them.
Absolutely, and that's a good way to kind of draw the bow on this parsha. This parsha, if anything, elicits all of these conversations, and you can see how excited we get about that. I want to thank everyone for watching, for listening. We enjoy this. We enjoy sharing Torah with you. Mazel tov to all people celebrating Simchas, and to our friends at Ramah. Have a great start of the summer. And we're going to be with you every Shabbat, every week. You're going to have Parasha Talk coming to you, not live, but it's going to be coming to you on Ramah. We want to say to everyone, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
If my children are out there, if Barry's children are out there, your Abbas love you.
Take care. Bye-bye.